It depends on what you think the job of Congress is. Under our Constitution, Congress is charged with two basic functions. Okay? Now, most textbooks in the chapter on Congress will identify more than two functions of Congress. 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 different functions of Congress. And they may differ from one textbook to another. That list of functions may differ from one textbook to another, but the two that always appear in every textbook are these two that you see on the screen. Okay? The lawmaking function and the representation function. And there's no question that those are the two critical functions of Congress. Congress is the national legislature. It has a legislative function. It is the responsibility for making the laws of the land. Okay? And when we think about the lawmaking function, the legislative function, that implies decision-making in a unified, integrated process. It tempts us to think about Congress as a single point of decision-making authority. Consider, for example, sort of the headlines that you typically see, whenever there's news about legislation that Congress is considering or that Congress has voted on. I don't know what your source of news is, if you have a source of news. Television, news broadcasts or internet news sources or old-fashioned newspapers or whatever. But, think about sort of the headlines that you might see. Congress passes health care reform bill. Okay? Or Congress rejects immigration reform bill. Right? Those are typically the kinds of headlines that you get from the popular news media, and that sort of tempts us to think about Congress, as I say, as a single point of decision-making authority. That Congress somehow as an integrated, unified institution is making a decision. And what most political scientists like Richard Fenno, who study the United States Congress, I'm not one of them I know a few things about the United States Congress, but it's not a subject of great research interest on my part. I've never been someone who really does a lot of research on the United States Congress, so I'm going to appeal to people like Richard Fenno and Randall Ripley and some of the others who have done lots of work on the United States Congress. What they will say is that most of the time we ought not think about Congress that way. Most of the time we ought not think about Congress as a single point of decision-making authority. It is, they will say, to use a term that's very common in the literature on Congress, is a fragmented institution with many points of decision-making authority. It's a multiplicity of decision centers where decision-making authority is spread out all over the place in the United States Congress. Okay? So this idea of one of the two principal functions of Congress as being the legislative function or the lawmaking function, which implies decision-making in a unified, integrated process, most of the time we ought not think about Congress that way. The other major function of Congress is the representation function, which implies full deliberation and debate, need for widespread consent, ample opportunity for a variety of interests to be heard in the decision-making process. And what I'm trying to really get across to you is that, to a very significant extent, these two fundamental functions of Congress, these two most important functions of Congress, are inherently at odds with one another. That is to say that to the extent that the representation function is maximized, to the extent that the individual representatives and senators in Congress place an emphasis on the representation function. And who are they representing? Hey, if we could get Pete Olson in this room next Friday, right? He comes in here with me next Friday, and we just have, 50 minutes. It might not be that far-fetched. After all, we just had an election yesterday. He's probably in the district, right? Celebrating his re-election with his, constituents. Right? So it's not, I'm not going to ask him, don't worry. But it's not so hard to imagine that, he might, or if we could get, Mr. Farenthold down there in the 27th District, or Mr. McCall in the 10th Congressional District, any one of these three, and we could ask them, we could actually, what do you believe your main job is, your most important job is, as a representative in the U.S. House of, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, what is your most important job? Anybody want to take a shot? I mean, we're just speculating, and you're speculating. We don't know because we don't have him here to ask this question. But what do you think, given everything that we're talking about here, how do you think Mr. Olson might answer that question? Or Mr. Farenthold or Mr. McCall? Go ahead.
It's either to follow whatever or represent whatever the desires are of the constituents, or it's probably more authoritative, where the representative is almost like a trustee, where he doesn't care much about the constituents.
But even those representatives who function as so-called trustees, and we may have had an opportunity earlier in the semester to make that distinction. If not, maybe we'll have an opportunity to make it a little bit. Even those that function as a trustee, the idea that, well, the voters elected me because they trust my judgment and I'm going to, pretty much do the right. They still have some notion of what they're doing is in the interest of their constituents, right? Okay? So I think, yeah, you're going to get some variation of that answer closer to the way that you said, the first option. I think Mr. Olson, Mr. Farenthold, Mr. McCall are likely to give us some variation of this answer. My main job in Washington is to represent the interests of the people of the 22nd Congressional District. My main job in Washington is to represent the interests of the people of the 10th Congressional District. My main job in Washington is to represent the interests of the people of the 27th Congressional District. And you know what? If we were to then go out to Sacramento, California, or to Tallahassee, Florida, or Portland, Maine, or any point in between those extreme, and ask the representative from those districts, what is your primary job in Washington? I think the representative from Sacramento, California is going to say, my primary job is to represent the interests of the people of Sacramento, California, or whatever the district is, the number of that district, right? Or Portland, Maine, or Tallahassee, Florida, or any other points in between. You see, that's the representation function at work, right? Why is, it's so important for us to understand this? Well, because to the extent that each of the 435 members are representing as in their minds, their primary job is to represent the interests of their constituents. That's first and foremost. By the way, why do you think they're so concerned about that? If you do a good job representing the interest of your constituents, that is likely going to lead to what? Re-election. Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty easy to understand that constituency focus, right? What I'm trying to get you to understand, though, is how that works against the lawmaking function.